In the small town of Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, a tragic chain of events begins to unravel when a sheriff's dark secret comes to light. A young woman's courage to stand against abuse sets the stage for an emotional reckoning in a community grappling with systemic injustice. This is the story of Elena Carter, a 17-year-old who fought back against oppression and changed the lives of everyone around her. In the 2009, Elena Carter, a 17-year-old black girl, lived in the quiet but suffocatingly small town of Cedar Ridge, Tennessee. Her life was a delicate balance of survival and quiet ambition. She lived with her parents, though calling it a home would have been an exaggeration. Their small, decaying house on the outskirts of town had once been a cheerful place, painted a bright yellow. But over the years, it faded to a dull, peeling gray. The yard, overgrown with weeds, mirrored the neglect that defined Elena's upbringing. Elena's parents, Brenda and Leonard Carter, were distant and absorbed in their own struggles. Brenda, once a hopeful seamstress, had long since stopped dreaming and turned to alcohol to dull her sense of failure. Leonard, a former factory worker, spent most of his time at a nearby bar, nursing his bitterness over lost jobs and opportunities. Their neglect wasn't outright cruelty, but a tired indifference, leaving Elena to fend for herself emotionally and often financially. They saw her not as a beacon of hope, but as another burden in an already difficult life. Despite this, Elena held on to her dreams. She wanted to escape Cedar Ridge, go to college, and make something of herself. Her grades in high school were excellent, but without guidance or support, she had no idea how to navigate scholarships or applications. Instead, she took up odd jobs, cleaning houses, babysitting, and working at a small diner to save money, hoping that one day she might figure it out. Her life was lonely. She had no close friends, and the racial dynamics of Cedar Ridge only deepened her isolation. The town, with its deep-seated prejudices, saw Elena as invisible at best and a target at worst. Her loneliness was a quiet ache, one she pushed aside as she focused on surviving and dreaming of something better. Sheriff Robert Harlan had been an imposing figure in Cedar Ridge for nearly 2 decades. At 47, he was the town's law and order, his word almost gospel. To the public, Harlan was a model of authority, firm, disciplined, and committed to keeping the town safe. But beneath this facade was a darker truth. Harlan had a reputation that most dared not speak of openly. Rumors swirled about his temper, about women who left town after run-ins with him, and about the way his eyes lingered on vulnerable young girls. To the townspeople, these were whispers, easily dismissed as idle gossip. Harlan, after all, was the sheriff, the man who upheld the town's peace. What the town didn't see was Harlan's view of power. He didn't just enforce the law, he bent it to his will. He enjoyed control, and his ability to intimidate was as much a weapon as the gun at his hip. Harlan's authority had gone unchecked for years, and in a town like Cedar Ridge, no one dared challenge him. It was July 15th, 2009, a sweltering summer day when Harlan first took notice of Elena Carter. She had been walking home from her job at the diner, her uniform sticking to her back from the heat. Her path took her past the sheriff's office, where Harlan sat on the front steps, watching the street with his usual authoritative gaze. When his eyes landed on Elena, something shifted. To Harlan, Elena wasn't just another resident of Cedar Ridge. She was young, pretty, and isolated, an easy target. He began to find ways to cross paths with her. At first it seemed coincidental. He would show up at the diner during her shift, casually remarking on how hard she worked. Later, he would stop her on the street, asking if she felt safe walking home alone. To Elena, it felt strange, but she dismissed it as the sheriff doing his job. By August, Harlan's presence became more frequent and intrusive. He began visiting her parents' home under the pretense of checking in on the neighborhood. Her parents, indifferent and eager to avoid trouble, welcomed him without question. They never noticed the way his gaze lingered on their daughter, or how his tone changed when he spoke to her. For Elena, his presence became an oppressive shadow. The shift from casual to predatory was subtle but chilling. Harlan began offering her rides home from work, insisting it wasn't safe for her to walk alone. At first she hesitated, but his persistence and her fear of upsetting him wore her down. These car rides started with idle conversation, but over time, his questions grew personal. He asked about her family, her dreams, and her loneliness. He framed his inquiries as concern, but Elena felt a growing unease. It was on August 22nd, 2009, during one of these rides, that Harlan's intentions became unmistakable. He placed his hand on her knee as he talked, his grip firm and unyielding when she tried to shift away. His words were smooth, but carried an undercurrent of menace. He told her he could protect her, make her life easier, but the unspoken implication was clear. His protection came at a cost. Elena's refusal to comply with his advances led to a chilling escalation. Over the next weeks, Harlan began using his position of power to intimidate her. He would show up unannounced at her workplace or home, lingering just long enough to remind her of his authority. When she avoided him, he called her out publicly, framing it as concern for her safety. By September, Harlan's actions turned explicitly threatening. He began suggesting that her family might face legal trouble if she didn't trust him. The Carter family, already strained, became more volatile under the weight of Harlan's subtle threats. Elena knew her parents wouldn't stand up to him. They barely stood up for themselves. Elena felt trapped. Her once bright dreams of escaping Cedar Ridge began to feel like a distant fantasy. She couldn't tell anyone. Her parents wouldn't care, and the townsfolk wouldn't believe her. The racial dynamics of Cedar Ridge only amplified her fear. She was a young black woman accusing the town's white sheriff. The odds felt insurmountable. Her nights were filled with restless sleep and nightmares of Harlan's looming figure. She began documenting everything in a small, battered notebook. The dates he visited, the things he said, the bruises she hid beneath her clothes. The act of writing became her lifeline, a way to hold on to some sense of control. But Harlan was always watching, always waiting, and Elena knew that each day she resisted, the danger grew. By October 15th, 2009, Elena Carter had reached her breaking point. The nights were the hardest. Alone in her room, she often lay awake, haunted by the weight of the sheriff's threats and the ever-growing dread in her chest. But the small flutter she began to feel one evening changed everything. At first, she dismissed it as nerves, but a visit to the town's clinic confirmed her deepest fear and her greatest hope. She was pregnant. The news was devastating and empowering at the same time. For days, she stared at the positive test result, her mind racing between panic and determination. The thought of her unborn child being tied to Harlan filled her with anger and despair, but it also sparked a fierce resolve. She could no longer endure his control. Her child would not grow up in fear. She had to protect this life at all costs, even if it meant risking her own. Elena started documenting everything. The battered journal she had kept tucked under her mattress became her greatest weapon. She wrote every detail of her encounters with Harlan, describing his visits, the threats, and the way he manipulated her. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words carried the strength of someone desperate for justice. She hid the journal in a loose floorboard beneath her bed, checking it every night to ensure it was safe. In addition to her journal, Elena began quietly gathering physical evidence. She collected torn pieces of her clothing that bore the marks of Harlan's aggression, along with photographs of bruises on her arms and legs. She even kept a broken bracelet that had snapped during one of his violent outbursts. Each item felt like a piece of armor, something that could protect her when the time came. Her plan to expose Harlan took shape slowly but deliberately. She researched local laws at the town library, learning about the rights she had never been taught. She began discreetly asking questions to anyone who might know more about the sheriff's past, careful not to reveal her intentions. It was during one of these inquiries, on October 25th, 2009, that her plan began to unravel. A deputy she spoke with, oblivious to her vulnerability, casually mentioned her questions to Harlan. It was the October 29th, 2009, when the storm finally broke. Elena had just returned home from work, the chill of the autumn evening seeping through her thin jacket. She sensed something was off as soon as she stepped through the door. The house was unnervingly quiet, her parents absent. She turned to close the door, and there he was, Sheriff Robert Harlan, standing in her small living room, his silhouette stark against the dim light of the single overhead bulb. Harlan's presence was suffocating. He knew everything: the questions, the evidence, the plan. Her fragile web of resistance had been torn apart. His voice was calm, almost casual, as he began speaking, but the undercurrent of menace was unmistakable. He accused her of betrayal, of trying to destroy him, and made it clear that there would be no escape for her. Elena tried to explain herself, but her words faltered under his glare. Her fear was palpable, but so was her anger. This time, she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She stood her ground, her hands trembling but clenched at her sides. As Harlan stepped closer, the tension in the room became unbearable, like the air before a lightning strike. When she refused to back down, Harlan snapped. His rage erupted, and he lunged at her. The struggle was chaotic, the small room amplifying every sound: the crash of a knocked-over lamp, the scrape of shoes against the floor, and the sickening thud of a body hitting the wall. Harlan's strength overwhelmed her, and for a moment it felt as if all hope was slipping away. But then her hand brushed against something cold on the floor, a knife she had left after cutting fruit earlier that day. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, Elena grasped the knife and turned it on him. The blade sank into his side, and he staggered back, his face a mixture of shock and fury. Elena, gasping for breath and covered in bruises, watched as Harlan collapsed to the floor. Her body trembled violently as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. Through her terror, she realized she had to act. Grabbing the phone, she dialed 911. Her voice was shaky and barely audible, but the operator understood enough. Help was on its way. The Cedar Ridge Police Department arrived at the Carter home on October 29th, 2009, at 9:17 p.m. The scene they encountered was grim. Harlan's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Elena sat slumped against the wall, her face swollen, her arms and legs covered in fresh bruises. She made no attempt to run or resist as the officers entered. Instead, she simply raised her hands and waited. The town's coroner confirmed the cause of death: multiple stab wounds, with one fatal puncture to the abdomen. Forensic investigators immediately began documenting the scene. The overturned furniture and blood patterns painted a clear picture of a violent struggle, corroborating Elena's claim of self-defense. The bruises on her body further supported her account, and the knife, still clenched in her hand, matched the description she provided to officers on site. As news of the sheriff's death spread, the small town was thrown into turmoil. Harlan had been a polarizing figure, and his death ignited fierce debates. Some residents, particularly those who had suffered under his authority, quietly expressed relief that his reign had ended. Others, however, mourned the loss of a man they believed to be a hero. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the immediate incident. Detectives began digging into Harlan's past, uncovering a pattern of abuse and misconduct that had been buried for years. Former victims came forward, sharing stories eerily similar to Elena's, stories of threats, coercion, and violence that had been ignored by the system. Elena's case became a flashpoint for national conversations about systemic abuse and racial inequality. Activists and civil rights organizations descended on Cedar Ridge, demanding accountability for the years of silence that had allowed Harlan to operate unchecked. The town became the focus of intense media scrutiny, with reporters documenting every detail of the investigation and trial. While some in the community rallied behind Elena, others vilified her, refusing to believe that Harlan could have done any wrong. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs and chants a stark reminder of the deep divisions in Cedar Ridge. For Elena, the weight of public opinion was both overwhelming and irrelevant. She had survived, and now she would fight for her voice to be heard. The trial of Elena Carter began on December 14, 2009, under the cold, gray skies of Cedar Ridge. The courthouse, usually a quiet building where minor disputes and property cases were handled, became the epicenter of a storm. The streets outside were lined with protesters, their chants and signs reflecting a town torn in two. Some supported Elena, calling her brave and demanding justice for the years of abuse hidden in the shadows. Others mourned Sheriff Robert Harlan, labeling her a murderer who had taken a pillar of the community. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in as the trial began, every seat filled with reporters, locals, and supporters on both sides. Elena sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a modest dress, her face pale but resolute. Behind her, a small group of activists and supporters, mostly strangers, who had been drawn to her case, offered quiet encouragement with their presence. Her defense attorney, Margaret Vance, was a fiery advocate known for representing marginalized clients. She had taken the case pro bono, seeing it as not just a fight for Elena's freedom, but as a broader indictment of a broken system. Margaret was methodical, her every movement deliberate, as she prepared to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Charles Morton, was a sharp contrast. Morton was a seasoned attorney, a product of Cedar Ridge's old guard, and a staunch defender of the town's institutions. He painted Elena as manipulative, suggesting that her actions were premeditated and driven by anger rather than fear. To Morton, the sheriff's status as a protector of the community was unquestionable, and he used every tool at his disposal to uphold Harlan's legacy. The trial was intense from the start. The prosecution opened with graphic details of Sheriff Harlan's death, emphasizing the multiple stab wounds and framing the violence as excessive. They called neighbors who testified about Harlan's concern for Elena, twisting his predatory behavior into an image of benevolence. Morton's arguments leaned heavily on character, portraying Harlan as a dedicated public servant whose only fault was caring too much. But Margaret Vance was prepared. She began by presenting Elena's journal, a small but powerful artifact. The pages, filled with trembling handwriting, documented months of fear, manipulation, and abuse. Forensic analysis verified the journal's authenticity, and its contents were devastating. The descriptions of bruises, torn clothing, and threats painted a vivid picture of a young woman cornered by someone who held unchecked power. Margaret then introduced the physical evidence. Photographs of Elena's injuries, taken the night of Harlan's death, were projected onto a screen for the jury. The bruises on her arms and neck, the scratches on her legs, and the swelling on her face told a story of violence that couldn't be ignored. Forensic experts testified about the defensive wounds on her body and the pattern of blood splatters in the Carter home, confirming that the struggle aligned with her account of self-defense. The most powerful moment came when former victims of Harlan took the stand. One by one, women who had left Cedar Ridge or remained silent for years found their voices. They spoke of threats, coercion, and the same predatory behavior Elena described. These testimonies revealed a chilling pattern. Harlan had used his position to target vulnerable women, silencing them with fear. Their stories turned the courtroom into a space of collective reckoning, and the weight of their words was felt by everyone present. Elena's parents sat in the back of the courtroom, their faces blank. They had never been involved in her life in a meaningful way, and their presence now felt like an afterthought. Elena didn't look at them, focusing instead on the strangers who had become her support system. The emotional distance between them was a reminder of the isolation she had endured long before Harlan entered her life. Margaret's closing argument was a masterclass in empathy and logic. She didn't just argue for Elena's innocence. She framed the case as an indictment of the systems that had failed her. She spoke of how small towns often protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, how silence enables abuse, and how Elena had shown incredible strength by fighting back. The jury listened intently, their expressions shifting as her words sank in. It was December 22nd, 2009, when the jury delivered their verdict. The room was silent as the foreperson stood, the tension almost unbearable. The words, "not guilty," echoed through the courtroom, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. For a moment, there was no reaction, just stunned stillness. Then supporters erupted into cheers, while others gasped in disbelief. Elena remained seated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Tears streamed down her face, but her expression was one of quiet relief rather than triumph. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a small but powerful gesture of solidarity. The courtroom's atmosphere became chaotic. Supporters rushed to embrace Elena, their relief palpable. Reporters scrambled to document the reactions, their cameras flashing in rapid succession. On the other side of the room, Harlan's supporters sat in stunned silence, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Morton's face was stoic, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his frustration. Outside, the streets were alive with emotion. Activists celebrated the verdict as a victory for justice, chanting Elena's name and holding signs that read, "No more silence." Detractors held their own vigil, mourning what they saw as a betrayal of a man who had kept the town safe. Elena's acquittal was more than a personal victory. It became a catalyst for change. Her story inspired other women in Cedar Ridge to come forward, sharing their own experiences of abuse and intimidation. The town, once silent about its dark underbelly, was forced to confront the systemic failures that had allowed Harlan's behavior to persist for so long. National media picked up the story, framing Elena as a symbol of resilience and courage. Civil rights organizations used her case to push for reforms, demanding greater accountability for law enforcement and better protections for victims of abuse. For Elena, the verdict marked the end of one battle and the beginning of another. She left Cedar Ridge soon after the trial, determined to build a life free from the shadows of her past. But her story remained, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, one voice can ignite change. By January 2010, just weeks after her acquittal, Elena Carter packed what little she owned into a battered suitcase. The once overwhelming relief of the trial's verdict had given way to an ache she couldn't ignore. Cedar Ridge was no longer her home. It had never been, not really. Every street, every familiar face, carried the weight of what had happened. She knew she had to leave, for herself, and for the life growing inside her. The bus station was quiet that morning. The air was heavy with frost, and the faint hum of the heater in the waiting room was the only sound. Elena sat alone, her hands resting on her belly, now showing the faintest curve of pregnancy. She thought about the town she was leaving behind, the memories she was taking with her. Cedar Ridge had scarred her, but it had also shaped her in ways she was just beginning to understand. It had taught her resilience, the strength to fight back, even when the odds were against her. Elena's destination was a nearby city, Knoxville, where she had found a modest place to stay through a women's shelter. The transition was daunting. The shelter was clean but impersonal, and the stories of the other women she met there were both heartbreaking and hauntingly familiar. Many, like her, had been victims of abuse. Their shared experiences created a bond stronger than words. For the first time in her life, Elena didn't feel completely alone. She began volunteering at the shelter almost immediately. At first, her tasks were simple: folding laundry, organizing donations, and helping prepare meals. But as the weeks passed, she found herself drawn to the women's stories. Their pain mirrored her own, and her presence offered them comfort. Elena realized she wanted to do more than just listen. She wanted to help rebuild the lives of others, just as she was rebuilding her own. By April 2010, Elena had enrolled in a community college program to study social work. It wasn't easy, balancing her classes with her volunteer work at the shelter, and later, part-time jobs, pushed her to her limits. But every time she felt overwhelmed, she would think of her unborn child. She would place her hand on her belly and remind herself that this wasn't just for her. It was for them both. On a rainy night in July 2010, Elena gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Isaiah, a name she had chosen months before for its meaning, salvation, and hope. Holding him in her arms for the first time, she felt a profound sense of purpose. Isaiah was her light in the darkness, a symbol of everything she had fought for and everything she still hoped to achieve. The early days of motherhood were both exhausting and healing. Isaiah's cries filled the small apartment Elena had managed to secure with the help of the shelter's resources. She would often sit by the window late at night, rocking him to sleep while staring out at the city lights. Her thoughts would drift back to Cedar Ridge, not to the pain, but to the people who had supported her, the strangers who had believed in her innocence, and the women who had shared their own truths in court. Back in Cedar Ridge, Elena's departure left a void that couldn't be ignored. Her trial had sparked conversations that refused to fade, even in her absence. Local newspapers continued to publish stories about Sheriff Robert Harlan's abuses as more victims stepped forward. The weight of their testimonies forced the town to confront its complicity. Civic leaders, once staunch defenders of Harlan, began to shift their stance, pressured by public outcry. By late 2010, reforms were underway. The Cedar Ridge Police Department faced an independent review, uncovering years of misconduct that had been swept under the rug. Several officers resigned, unable to face the scrutiny, while others were fired outright. The department implemented new policies, including mandatory abuse training and oversight committees, to ensure no one else could wield power unchecked. Local schools and churches also began hosting discussions about domestic abuse and systemic inequality. For the first time, the town openly acknowledged its dark past, with leaders urging residents to hold one another accountable. While not everyone embraced the changes, the momentum was undeniable. Elena's story continued to resonate beyond Cedar Ridge. Journalists followed her journey, framing her as a survivor who had turned her pain into purpose. Activist groups invited her to speak at events, where she shared her experience not as a tale of victimhood, but as one of resilience and hope. Each time she spoke, she felt a little stronger, the cracks in her spirit slowly mending. By 2011, Elena was halfway through her degree in social work. She dreamed of opening her own center one day, a place where women like her could find safety, support, and a way forward. Isaiah, now a curious toddler, became her anchor. His laughter filled their small apartment, a constant reminder of how far they had come. Though Elena's life was moving forward, the shadows of her past remained. Some nights, she woke in a cold sweat, Harlan's face vivid in her mind. The fear he had instilled in her wasn't something she could simply forget, but instead of letting it consume her, she used it as fuel. She kept her journal close, a reminder of where she had been and how far she had come. On July 15th, 2012, Isaiah's second birthday, Elena returned to Cedar Ridge for the first time since her trial. It wasn't an easy decision, but she felt it was time to confront the place that had nearly broken her. She visited the gravesite of an elderly neighbor who had once shown her kindness and walked past the courthouse where her life had changed forever. The town was quieter now, less divided, but the scars of its history were still visible. As she stood in the town square, holding Isaiah's hand, she felt a sense of closure. Cedar Ridge no longer held power over her. She had reclaimed her life, and with it, her future. This is a beautiful story that shows how even a tragedy can change someone's life